I got some advice for you. Listen to this.
Listen now, I invite you with open ears to this book that we love, Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verses 1 through 7. Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. To draw near to listen is better than to offer the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they are doing evil. Be not rash with your mouth, nor let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God. For God is in heaven, and you are on earth. Therefore let your word be few. For a dream comes with much business, and a fool's voice with many words. When you vow a vow to God, do not delay paying it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you vow. It is better that you should not vow than that you should vow and not pay. Let not your mouth lead you into sin, and do not say before the messenger that it was a mistake. Why should God be angry at your voice and destroy the work of your hands? For when dreams increase and words grow many, there is vanity. But God is the one that you must fear. This is the word of God. Thanks be to God. Let me pray for us. Eternal God, in the reading of Scripture, may your word be heard. In the meditations of all of our hearts this morning, may your word be known. And in the faithfulness of our lives, may your word be shown. We pray this through the name of Christ, our Savior. Amen. Let's begin with the very end of this passage. Verse 7, the last line there says, For when dreams increase and words grow many, there is vanity, but God is the one you must fear. This is the key line in this text, and it sheds light on the rest of it, which we're going to walk through here in just a moment. All of our religion, all of our religious activity is pointless apart from, as he says in this last line, a genuine fear of God. So I want to take a moment this morning to clarify what the fear of God is. It is a phrase that you will encounter frequently in Scripture. And it's used in Scripture to mean really one of three things: title, terror, or trust. Title, terror, or trust. And what really helped me understand that some years ago was a passage in the Old Testament book of Jonah, where in the first chapter, all three forms of that fear of God appear in the same place. So sometimes the fear of God is used as a title. In other words, it differentiates the people of God from people who worship a different God or no God at all. Similar to the way in our culture that when someone refers to himself or herself as a Christian, they're not necessarily saying that they wholeheartedly are committed to the ways of Jesus. They might simply mean that they're not Buddhist, or they're not Muslim, or they're not Hindu, or they're not Jewish. In Jonah chapter 1, Jonah's on this ship fleeing from Nineveh, fleeing from the presence of God, or at least trying to, and the sailors with him ask him who he is. He responds by saying in that moment that he is one who fears God. I'm a God-fearer. Now in that moment, he's fleeing from God. He is literally running away from faithfulness to God. So when he says in that moment, I fear God, it's not like an expression of his deep trust and reverence there. He's literally fleeing away from God. He's using it as a title. It differentiates him from the pagan sailors and the worship of a different God. Other times, the fear of God means terror. And that's the initial response from the sailors on the ship with Jonah. When they find out that Jonah is fleeing from God, it says that they are exceedingly afraid. That they fear the power and they fear the holiness of God, which they are witnessing in the strength of this storm that's unfolded around them. And there is a real value to this kind of fear of God. We can become, and I would assume many of us do become, have become, far too comfortable with what is holy and what is powerful and what is infinitely beyond our ability to control or to comprehend. So don't, out of familiarity, if you have been a Christian for a while, if you've studied the Bible for a while, don't immediately always jump to the third definition of fearing God. There's something right and good about these sailors recognizing who God really is and being exceedingly afraid at the demonstration of his power. But there is a third meaning to the fear of God, and it's trust. It's trust. We are not created by God to ultimately be afraid of him, but to be near to him, to be at peace with him, and to trust him. And at the end of Jonah chapter 1, the sailors, they see the work of God, and they believe in God. And it says there that they feared the Lord exceedingly. So this kind of fear is respect and it's reverence for who God is. And it's so much so that as it does with these sailors in Jonah 1, it spills out of them into worship. It spills out of them into this willing kind of submission to God. So this fear of God, this kind of fear of God acknowledges, you are God, I am not, and because of that, I will trust in you. I will walk in your ways. And it's this kind of fear, this third kind of fear, that I think Koheleth particularly has in mind when he writes there in verse 7, God is the one that you must fear. With that backdrop then, two things that I want to walk through in the rest of our time. The vanity of empty religious activity and the vanity of empty vows. So first, the vanity of empty religious activity. These first three verses of chapter 5, they're about regular, recurring religious activities. Gathering for worship and prayer. Guard your steps, Koheleth says. In other words, watch your step when you go to the house of God. Why? Because going with the people of God to the house of God is not a casual, neutral kind of activity. What we do when we gather for worship is incredibly important. And it's better, Koheleth says, to simply come and to listen than to participate in that foolishly. At the time that he writes this, one of the primary religious activities that would occur at the house of God, at the temple, were animal sacrifices. And a couple months ago in August, my friend Alec Millen was here. He preached from Leviticus about what that entailed and just the sheer number of sacrifices that would occur at the temple every single day. Sacrifices were a good and a necessary part of faithful worship for the people of God. They were commanded by God under the Old Covenant. But there's also this refrain that shows up in Scripture and that Koheleth begins to echo here in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, that what God has always been after is not really the sacrifice itself, but the heart of the one who offers it. 1 Samuel 15, behold, to obey is better than to sacrifice. Psalm 51, you do not delight, God, in sacrifice, or I would bring it. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit. A broken and contrite heart you will not despise. Hosea chapter 6, for I desire, God being I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. And then there's Proverbs 15. The sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination to the Lord. In other words, this religious activity does not magically, in and of itself, and apart from a specific kind of heart posture, accomplish anything. It does not make the wicked righteous, it makes the wicked a fool to do so. It makes the wicked a fool, and rather than a good act in and of itself, the act of sacrificing becomes, as the last word of verse 1 says, evil. It becomes evil. That sounds really harsh, doesn't it? This is some scathing language in Ecclesiastes chapter 5. But think about this. The sacrificial system is God's people putting forward for themselves a substitute. It is guiding a way of atoning for the guilt of the sin of his people. So in his mercy, the righteous anger, the wrath of God against sin is going to be poured out on that animal rather than on his people. But if you aren't a worshiper in your heart, if you're just a casual participant, or worse, if you have zero intent to actually follow the way of this God, then when you participate in sacrifices, you celebrate something that you're on the wrong side of. You celebrate something you're on the wrong side of. You hold high the justice and the judgment of God when that justice and judgment for you is not salvation but your destruction. So at best, someone who worships like this, as Koheleth talks about in Ecclesiastes 5, at best they're short-sighted or they're just ignorant of what they're doing. At worst, it's utter mockery of God. It's heaping more judgment on yourself. unless we think this is something that only applies to worship under the Old Covenant. It's exactly for this reason why you will hear myself. Listen now, I invite you with open